I have one more lead to chase down in my quest for the truth about the COVID cover-up. This one brings me to the foggy and mist-shrouded shores of England, where I'm meeting with Matt Ridley, the esteemed science writer and one-time member of the House of Lords. Ridley's book Viral, co-authored with Alina Chan, was one of the very first serious efforts to expose the real origin of the COVID-19 virus. And since its publication, he has remained tireless in his pursuit of answers.
It is much more likely that it is a natural occurrence from an animal to a human.
Social distancing is absolutely critical. And if you can't social distance and you're outside, you must wear a mask.
The NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
Matt, thank you for talking to me.
Matt, it's good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
I have been following your journey from the beginning of the pandemic, and you've been on my show a number of times talking about your work on this. And I wanted to talk to you in the context of this series because I think in a lot of ways you can tie this whole whodunit story that I'm trying to unwind together. Hopefully you can solve all of my remaining challenges and problems. Because you're well known as a pro-science guy. You've written extensively about this. Give us a little bit of your background and your writing in defense of the scientific process.
Well, I'm trained as an evolutionary biologist. I wrote books about both evolution and genetics, several books, and have followed genetic science very closely. So I was well placed in that sense to understand what was going on. But I was also a partisan in favor of genetically modified crops, which I think are on the whole a very good thing, in favor of vaccines, in favor of biomedical interventions like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, all that kind of thing. And I actually led campaigns to persuade the British government to approve things like mitochondrial replacement therapy, which is basically a genetic replacement technique for human beings. So I'm pro-science, and I'm pro-genetic science, in particular pro-biomedical science. I'm not, therefore, a natural conspiracy theorist about what scientists might be doing to damage the human race. That's not my natural habitat at all. And therefore, for me, it was quite a wrench to come to the realization in the first few months of 2020 that it looked like a devastating pandemic had been unleashed by an experiment that almost certainly went wrong. And that was the conclusion I was eventually came to, as I say, reluctantly. And that's why I think it's quite important that people like me who are not looking out for evidence that science does wrongdoing admit it when we see it.
Your instinct was to trust the science.
Correct. In the first few months of the pandemic, in January, February, March, I looked briefly at the possibility that this might have come out of a lab. My instinct was that we're not that good. Virologists are not yet that good at making highly infectious viruses. Turned out I was out of date, actually. I hadn't been following virology closely enough. Then in March of 2020, the proximal origin paper came out in which 5 virologists said, we've looked at the genome of this virus and we can rule out genetic engineering. I didn't read their paper very carefully. I thought, well, they probably know what they're talking about. And so I told colleagues in Parliament in the UK, no, we can rule that out. The scientists have ruled it out. That was a big mistake. That paper was flawed is one way of describing it. Its arguments simply didn't stack up, and they were very weak arguments anyway. But it took me a while to go back and realize that, because by then I had seen evidence that we did need to take a lab leak seriously.
So not only are you a very successful writer of books about science and scientific process and innovation, but at the time you were serving in the House of Lords on the Science Committee. So your opinion matters in terms of the UK's response to COVID. When did you realize that you had been duped by that paper?
Middle of May 2020, I was commissioned by the Wall Street Journal to write an article called "The Bats Behind the Pandemic," trying to work out how this virus had come from bats into human beings, which it did. You know, the natural ancestor of this virus is undoubtedly a bat virus. And as part of that, I suddenly saw a reprint published. Towards the end of drafting my article, actually, I had to sort of delay it because of this preprint, which said this virus is very well adapted to infecting humans. It hasn't had to do very much mutating in the first few months compared with SARS-1 in 2002-03. And therefore a lab leak is a possibility. And I contacted the authors of that article, and Alina Chan was the main author of that article, and she responded with more detailed information than I had seen up until that point about why this evidence pointed to it being necessary to consider the possibility of a laboratory accident. But at the same time, while I was doing that, George Gao, the head of the Centers for Disease Control in Beijing, the main man on investigating the origin of the pandemic in China, came out with a statement that it did not begin in the market, that the market was, as he put it, a victim, not a perpetrator. That was his conclusion after surveying the animals in the market and the people in the market and finding none of the telltale signs. We now know, because we've seen his data published subsequently, none of the telltale signs that you would expect. No infected animals, they found none. No infected animal vendors, something they found very quickly in the case of SARS-1. No antibodies in animal vendors or people in food preparation experts or something like that. No pattern of it turning up in more than one market. Again, that was a pattern in SARS. All of these things are what you would expect. They're the very minimum you would expect to find if that virus had begun in the market. So at the same time, the market hypothesis suddenly was weakened, and the lab hypothesis was suddenly needing to be taken more seriously because of the genetic evidence. The third thing that happened while I was researching this point, we found out more about the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the COVID. We found that they had changed its name, effectively. And it took a while. It took several months for us to realize that RATG13, the name they gave to this bat virus that was 96.2% similar, the name they gave to it, RATG13, was a name that had never been used before. I spent several days searching the internet and trying to find evidence of where this virus had been found before, and it was like a ghost. It did not exist. And Monali Rahalkar in India and Rosanna Segreto in Norway had tracked down that there was an identical virus with a different name. So why did they change the name? They had called it 4991 when they found it in 2013, and they'd called it that when they'd done experiments on it later, right up till 2018. But suddenly, when they announced that it was the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2, they call it RATG13. It's very hard to avoid the implication that they did not want us looking into the backstory of where this virus had been found. That backstory got very interesting very quickly and was one of the reasons I then took the lab leak more and more seriously.
Countries like Ridley's own United Kingdom, where dozens of people are arrested every day over social media posts deemed offensive by the British government. But even in the United States, where the First Amendment makes freedom of speech the law of the land, science has become constrained by a web of top-down control and perverse incentives. I can speak more from the American perspective. It seems to be almost completely captured by government agencies and government funding. Now it's not 100% government funding, but the imprimatur of NIH, of Anthony Fauci, when he was in charge, probably drove all the funding in certain directions and away from the heretics.
Well, you can see it very explicitly in some of the offline conversations that people like the Proximal Origin authors were having about how important it was for them to get the approval of Anthony Fauci or Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust in terms of securing their future funding, but also in terms of securing tenure, which they actually say at one point, that's tenure secured, etc. So there has been invented a very top-down, very government-dominated, single way of thinking in many different branches of biomedicine recently, and it's problematic.
So you're writing this first piece for the Wall Street Journal, and a lot of this new evidence emerges, and it starts to seem pretty fishy. That the natural origin story is making less and less sense. What was the reaction to the article when you raised the question?
It's a gradual thing. I raised the point gingerly at first, but I then began to write other articles saying we need to take a lab leak seriously, and there is serious pushback. It's a conspiracy theory that is literally censored on Facebook. You're not even allowed to mention it as a possibility. Even on Twitter, it is fairly seriously suppressed, although not completely. And as for the mainstream media, the BBC, the Guardian, the New York Times, these kind of outlets, the Los Angeles Times, they simply rubbish it as a mad conspiracy right-wing theory that it could have come from a lab. And they say it's been debunked. Well, it definitely hasn't been debunked. There's been an article called Proximal Origin which argues that it's not very likely. But we now know that the people writing that article thought the very opposite. All 5 of them were on the record in their private messages as saying that they thought a lab leak was friggin' likely, in the words of Christian Anderson, the lead author. And they went on saying this even after the article was published. So it's not that they thought this at first and then changed their mind, which is what they later claimed in congressional testimony. It took us until 2021, 2022 to really find out what was going on in private among the people who were so-called debunking the theory. But in the whole of 2020 and most of 2021, it was very difficult to discuss a lab leak in polite society in the mainstream media. You couldn't get the likes of the network broadcasters to talk about it at all. And the hard work was being done by relatively obscure, relatively independent researchers and journalists. The dam on that broke to some extent in May of 2021, when a letter was sent, organized partly by Alina Chan, to Science magazine, signed by a long list of scientists saying, look, there is enough evidence that we need to take this theory at least seriously as a possibility. it's important to realize that the research that was being done that led to the lab accident that almost certainly caused the pandemic wasn't just any old research. It was pandemic prevention research. It's the very thing it was trying to prevent caused it. And remember, this is the worst industrial accident ever to hit humankind by roughly 1,000-fold. In other words, Bhopal, the chemical leak that killed 25,000 people, is probably the worst industrial accident before this. This killed 25 million people, 1,000 times as many. It's incredibly important we find out how it happened. It's ludicrously important. And it's even more important we find out whether there was a cover-up. Because there was a cover-up of Watergate, which was quite important, but it didn't kill 25 million people.
We spoke to Jay Bhattacharya, who was one of the first dissidents who questioned the official narrative on the dangers of COVID.
At the time in January 2020, if you said that I'm not sure this number is right, then maybe it's less dangerous than people think. It's not maybe it's not 3.4%. Maybe it's less than that. That was seen as a sin, a cardinal sin.
And we spoke with Senator Rand Paul while he was still in the minority, frustrated that he just couldn't get answers to questions.
Let's say I want documents from the president. I can't make him. That's what I want. I want documents from HHS and NIH on the deliberation of gain and function. They won't give it to me. How do I make them?
And the more I dig into it, it looks like there was a concerted effort by government officials and other culpable parties to cover up what they had done. And so the question is not did they do it. I think we know what they did without any reasonable doubt. But why did they do it?